This short documentary series on the humanities in Europe today, which starts from Europe but will expand to cover, I hope, the whole world, is the initiative of the European network of humanities centers and institutes. We decided collectively with our colleagues that it would be a good idea to present a series of portraits of leading figures in the humanities in our part of the world, and to use them as sources of inspirations, as role models, if you wish, for practitioners and students alike. The portraits of these very sort of charismatic, highly accomplished, distinguished professionals accomplishes another aim. It allows us to trace a genealogical sort of portrait of where the humanities have been, where they are at today, and where they could go, insofar as each person that we interview is asked to trace their own itinerary, past, present, and future. And simply by asking a question like, what was your faculty called when you studied as an undergraduate? And noticing the semantic, the institutional, the political transformations that the field has gone through. Just by doing that, I think the viewers should be in a position to measure the extent of the changes and the extent of the vitality of the field. The hope of this mini-series is indeed that we can collectively, as practitioners but also as spectators, express our love for, our trust in, our respect for this amazing field of the humanities at a time in its history when it is coming under attack in the press, in the public debate, in policy making and financial decisions that are really penalizing this field. The humanities in the 21st century, as you will see in the different portraits of these great figures we're offering to you, are a vital, vibrant, critical, creative, extremely accountable field, proud of its history, confident of its place in the world, and very hopeful for the future. We really hope that you will enjoy watching these great figures, and maybe you will be yourself tempted to run out and interview somebody that you know in your own neighborhood, in your own circles, because the humanities are everywhere and for everybody.
So, you know, when it comes to my genealogy, sort of how I became a scholar, if there is a very short answer, it is I'm sort of a savage, a Rousseauian savage. I really do not belong fully to any field. And I think I was driven by certain questions. I grew up in Latin America at a time of in Argentina, at a time of extraordinary upsets, brutal military dictatorships. There was no discipline that was set up to fully account for the kinds of questions I began to develop. I also remember that I was one at home who could never throw anything out because I was so aware of poverty. So I would grab everything that my mother or my sister would throw out, you know, and then I secretly take it to some church which I know could distribute. So I was obsessed with questions of social justice and power from the start. When I entered university, I had a project. I had decided that sociology would be a good starting point. It didn't last long for me to establish that it was getting me nowhere. So I decided to design my own program that mixed economics with sociology, which led to a problematic dissertation defense, my dissertation being rejected. So then I said, to hell with this, and I went to study philosophy. I had a chance to be in France. And there I was, I mean, it was the time of Althusser, La Rupture épistémologique and all of that. But I decided, which I was influenced by, I decided that would not go away anytime soon. What would go away was the fact of the last living philosopher who had been a student of Jean Hippolyte, Jacques Dante. So I studied with him at a time when he was fully rejected by everybody, because that was definitely not the fashion. The Hegelian interpretation of Marx. And I then wrote a thesis on dialectic logic. So, you know, by the time I got to the kinds of issues that I started to work on 20 years ago as already a mature scholar, I had done a lot of traveling, intellectual traveling. And I was willing to be experimental, often as a form of naivete, which was clear in my graduate education, so I got many rejections. But also afterwards, after I got a very good postdoc at Harvard that opened up doors for me, and then I was writing my first book, The Mobility of Labor and Capital, a book that got rejected by 12 publishers, which is a lot. And then it became a very significant book, and I had all kinds of very distinguished people, especially economists, they had been the reviewers, telling me, you know, I was one of the reviewers for that book. I really knew that it was a good book, but I couldn't quite see it, and that was always out in the comments for the rejections. It was not, this is not ready for public. It was, this is brilliant material, but we can't see it working. And they were right, you know. So that just gives you a sense of this trajectory, you know, rather mixing up and building my own foundation. When I go around the world today, given the kind of life that I have, which has, you know, different pathways, is one way of putting it, I'm often asked the question, there seems to be a bit of confusion about who I am in terms of the existing disciplinary world. And I find myself giving different answers, you know. One kind of answer that I like to give is, I'm a scholar, rather than I'm a sociologist or I'm a political economist. If I have to give it a narrower definition, I would say, when the chips are down, I'm a European-style political economist. Political economy in the United States has a very narrow meaning, basically in political science, and it is definitely not what I do or what I would ever be interested in, the way they do it, because it's all about policy. I'm not interested in policy. I think policy is absolutely sort of superstructural and something that... but I do think, I often find myself saying this in lectures, especially recently, that I think the two disciplines that we need to understand our current moment and that sort of our ascendant are physics and philosophy, continental philosophy, because they can handle openness. A lot of the social sciences is now positioned in such a way that it depends on closure in terms of its domain of study. And I think that is not going to take us very far. So I think a certain kind of philosophy, and certainly physics, which is this extraordinary mix of complex precision and openness. And so I always say, you know, to understand today's economy, microeconomics, which assumes closure in order to deploy all its models, is not going to get you anywhere. Physics, algorithmic math, is going to take you there. You know, you know, there are many different answers. But another answer I give when I talk with more general audiences and when I talk with activists is, I want to discover something. I'm not interested in replicating and the sort of the dictum add to existing knowledge via discovering little shortcomings, little unaddressed issues. That doesn't interest me, you know. I am interested in mapping something that seems to me imprecisely mapped or not mapped at all. When you position yourself as somebody who wants to discover something that has not been explicated, you often have to really improvise. So when I was doing my research on the informal economy, at a time when people said in the developed world, we do not have informal economies. Today it's an accepted subject, but I had to fight hard to make that subject a recognizable subject. So you have to figure out how to discover and you have to demonstrate it empirically. Not all subjects I work on require that level of direct empirical establishing of something. You know, it could be data sets that exist, but that you use in a different way. So for instance, I said, okay, at night, let's go to immigrant communities at night and check out the garbage. If you see all kinds of pieces of cloth, you know, okay, some garment making here. And then you go several times, because there might be one shot, you know, she or he makes a dress for an occasion. No, and then you say, no, over. So that is one way. Another thing that I have done in my research, and that I call I have given it a name now, I call it the zone before method. In the social sciences, you can't just throw method out of the window. So if you need the freedom to position yourself vis-a-vis your object of study in whatever way you want or I want, I need to violate method, even if I eventually enter that zone of disciplining that method represents. And so I call that the space before method. And that is a space marked by a few, what I then so very elegantly refer to as analytic tactics, which I think sounds beautiful. You know, tactical analytics. I mean, how can you go wrong with that? And that is just to give 100% satisfaction to the academic world. You know, activists don't need to hear that. But the academic world really finds that very reassuring. I have now said that enough times that I have several publishers after me to say, please write a little book. And I say, it would be very little. I say, no matter how little, but write it on before method. And so some of these analytic tactics are, what don't I see when I invoke a powerful category? A powerful category has a good reason to exist, and it is collectively produced. It withstands the test of time, etc., etc. But you can interrogate it, you can interpolate. You can ask, if I use you, what are you keeping me from seeing? So that's one, which is absolutely a very simple operation. And for me, it works beautifully. It just gives me a wall against which to work, something strong. The stronger that wall, the better the product, you know, of contesting it, of interrogating it. The other one is the need to actively destabilize stabilized meanings. No complex meaning is stable forever. But, you know, it can have a life where it actually assumes a kind of stability. I would say in the post-Keynesian decades, the economy, the national state, the middle classes, those were all fairly stable meanings. They are now unstable. And so the notion is to do that as an active process. How do I actively destabilize the meaning of the economy? So the global city is an example of that. Actively destabilizing a category, the city, which is always understood as being part of a hierarchy contained and dominated by a national state. Well, by bringing in the global, I sort of unsettle. And I can tell you at the beginning, people were saying, but it's a contradiction in terms, the global. And I said, I know that, that's the point, you know. So those are just examples. Now, I have other ones, so that is what I deployed in my expulsions book. It's the notion that we make it. The we is clearly a rhetorical we, but the notion of making, that's a very partial focus, because there are all kinds of inherited genealogies of meaning, practices, you know, its powers and weaknesses of systems, etc., inherited. Finally, what I'm working on now is using the category territory, which is, territory is not space, it's not ground, it's not land, it's not terrain. I see it as a complex category that cannot be reduced to materiality, like you could with land or terrain, that contains embedded logics of power, which in our Western modernity takes on its most sort of accomplished form in the working liberal state. We no longer have working liberal states, basically, but you know, the Keynesian era is a good example. And embedded logics of claim-making, which again in our Western modernity takes a form of citizenship when it works, right? So I'm arguing on the one hand that territory is taking a very long analytic siesta, because it has one meaning. No matter how complex, a single meaning means it's not working analytically. It's a complex description of a complex condition. And so I want to make it work analytically, which means taking it out of that singular meaning and using this category as a window, a lens, through which to examine all kinds of things. Like I argue global markets in finance, high finance, not traditional banking, They make territory deep inside national territories. I want to ask whether Occupy movements are a first step in trajectories that will take on many, many different forms across time. And who knows what makings come out of that. I use dead land and dead water to argue we made that. And they are conditions. We make them invisible because if it's dead, it cannot be used. So that very pragmatic operational logic says, okay, it doesn't exist, doesn't matter. I want to say, no, it exists. It is a complex condition that has a whole history attached to it. I want to make it visible. And so I'm very interested in how these material conditions can become invisible also. Not necessarily in a phenomenological sense, that you have to go digging, into some, but I mean they are there, they are materially there, but they don't no matter. And so we are sort of shrinking the ground that we call the world. I think I am an activist. I've been an activist scholar in a way in the university, not as activist about non-academic issues, but about academic issues that I have fought hard. I've paid a price. It's come out okay, but I have paid a price to do my kind of research. And I always think that there are a set of people. When I was hired to the University of Chicago, and I was hired at the same time that other people like Homi Bhabha, Arjuna Padurai, we are all the other. A brilliant university knows that at some point it's got to bring in the other. The normal university system, they can't afford a person like me. I mean, I'm truly a negative for them because I will not show up for some of the basic criterion, that they have to get money and and I'm not alone in that thing. But I wonder how many there are who are like me or like Homi or who were not taken in. Because if I would not have wound up in top-level universities, I don't know, I would not be an academic. Because your mid-level university cannot afford me. I'm a luxury that they can't afford, this extravagant little whatever there, no. So University of Chicago is a place that really understood that. I mean, that is what makes it, I think, the best university in the country, even though it has a very conservative history, a history of expelling leftist professors and all of that. But then my basic choice of department, I opted for sociology because I knew that I was free there. Because that is a sociology, it's in New York. So it's a kind of sociology department that inevitably engages a larger reality. So you had people like Tilly there, the historian, who was forever using history as natural experiments, so a kind of complex sociology. Harrison White, who was a brilliant mathematician, who decided. So it's a kind of sociology department where I can be completely comfortable. Right, when I'm sort of asked, why do I do this work? Why don't I just sit at my computer and develop a little model, that could take you very far in the university? I mean, I think I've been a migrant all my life, I was born in the Netherlands, lived a little in Ireland, terribly poor Ireland in the 50s, early 50s. Then we moved to Buenos Aires, a whole other world. Then we lived in Italy, my family, for 14 years. So I don't know if that meant that no place was home, and hence every place was a kind of curiosity, because you had to sort of learn a bit from scratch. And that meant that there was you had a chance to experience the complexity of every intersection of place and time that you operated in or existed in, and I also had enormous fights with my father. I think this is part of my formation. I became a communist at 12, really a communist. I decided to study Russian. Nobody asked. I had the hardest time finding a teacher of Russian in Buenos Aires because, in New York, you open any newspaper, that local newspaper, and you have a whole list of all the things. You can do anything you want, a dog walker, a plant waterer, a teacher of I don't know what. There are so many people who are ready to make a bit of money, but not in Buenos Aires. And I had the hardest time, but then I found one and I studied it for 4 years. And I recall going to my parents when I was about 13 or 12 actually and saying, I think I need to go abroad when I do university. Mind you, I was not even in high school. And my parents, I remember that so well, both smiling and my father saying, Paris. And I said, Paris? No, Moscow. I swear, they all, you know, in my innocent mood, I didn't realize how far-fetched that was. but I realize now that, you know, it was sort of, so I think that contestation with my father, you know, me becoming a communist and fighting it out. We had a lot of, I was never daddy's girl. Huh? So I was always fighting with him about politics, and he became a buddy, a friend of Nasser. He was all into National Socialism, you know, and so he opened up worlds in our fights. And I remember he was saying, he worked in the oil industry, and he said, the new gold is going to be water. He wrote this statement that he tried to submit to the United Nations, you know. And so water now, of course, is a big issue, and I'm writing about it. So I think my foundational disagreement with my father's politics was something that also activated a thing in me, you know, that was very significant. But I think it is that I never was at home. Like one of these biographical chapters that I was asked to write is called Always a Foreigner, Always at Home. You know, I'm in that mode. I'm totally at home in the world, no matter where I am. But I also know I'm a foreigner. I'm an outsider here. I don't have that fantasy that I see often in young students that they say, you know, I belong there. I am part of that. No, you're not. Not if you were there a summer doing nice work, you know, in some part of Peru in the mountains with poor people. You're not. But you can still be totally engaged by it. And so that sense of a distance, you know, from place, that's sort of an answer.